Welcome again to Digging Deeper, YEG's Development Chat, brought to you by Clarity Development Advisory. I'm Dave Onashenko.
Rain and Zones.
And today we have a special guest, Mr. Chris Dulaba of Beljan Development, placemaker at Beljan. I've known Chris as a personal friend and someone in the industry for years. And he's going to talk. We're going to talk about a couple different things that are top of mind for Chris here, but all in relation to development in Edmonton, some of Chris's experiences, some of the work that related to some of the work he's done with Beljan and other projects. And so thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Dave and Raymond. It's nice to be here. Certainly good to have a local, sort of video podcast, call it what you will, to talk about development, something that I think, a lot of people are interested in and usually hear about it through other podcasts not tied to the City of Edmonton or online forums to talk about city building, development, architecture, you name it. So certainly happy to be here today.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So before we get into some of the topics we were going to discuss, can you give us a rundown? What does placemaker mean?
I'm asked that all the time. I think for the planners, we all kind of know it's a word or a term that's been widely used to create something that has a sense of place or permanence in a community or in a building or in a neighborhood or a block. And early on when I started with Beljan, one of the things that we do is every employee kind of has what's your title want to be, instead of sort of a generic director of development or vice president of development. Placemaking and placemaker was one that resonated with me. I mean, I'm a planner by education and a large part of my experience, and it just seemed to kind of be a good fit considering the role I would be undertaking with Beljan, and that's been it right there. And so again, placemaking is a widely used term in the planning circles, and so something that we carry and I think pride a lot on in every project that we've done to date is to ensure there's an element of permanence and sense of place and character that through different mechanisms, may it be through design, through the type of building, or really through the types of tenants that we envision in these spaces.
Awesome.
Well, that's fantastic.
Cool.
We forgot to mention off the top, this is a active conversation. So we do have a chat function. If you're watching live and you have questions you want to ask or comments, please put them in the chat. We see our first comment here from Professor Mark Seasons.
Colleagues, Mr. Seasons, nice to see you.
Absolutely. So my advisor for my master's, and
likewise, same thing. Yeah, nice to see him dialed in.
Absolutely. Put in your comments. Put your comments in the chat after, if you're watching this after a live broadcast, and we want this to be a dialogue where we're conversing about it. So we picked a couple topics here to talk about. Mm-hmm. And in relation to some of these things that you're talking about here, let's start with our first one, unlocking city-owned property. Mm-hmm. So the city is a big holder of tons of property throughout Edmonton, for example, right? City of Edmonton, we're talking about specifically. A bunch of land that they have some plans for tied to planning exercises that they seem to do and redo again and again.
Lather, rinse, repeat.
Exactly. So Rossdale comes to mind. Mm-hmm. Others, there's larger pockets of potential development land like Northlands where they do big planning exercises. Right. And then there's tons and Blatchford, obviously a big one too. Actually, Shirley, you could put a picture of Blatchford redevelopment. So this is one the city's actively participating in and acting as the developer.
Right.
They have their own little department within. They've taken the reins of that. And then there's tons of little parcels throughout the city that they own. And sometimes you see the for sale sign goes up, and it's a long process. It's a difficult process. Why don't we talk a little bit about that? What potential is there in your mind to kind of unlock some of that for the benefit of the City of Edmonton, for the benefit to achieve some of the goals that the city's put out in some of their mandates and their plans? What are other cities doing? What do you think can be done to maybe partner with the private industry? What's best practices look like in this regard?
Well, I think there's an amazing opportunity for municipalities, and in this case, the City of Edmonton, to work with the private sector to help them realize some of the redevelopment potentials that these properties have. And oftentimes what we've seen is, when municipalities have an idea and a vision to, redevelop a certain property, they kind of go through the formal planning process, whether it's bringing in a new statutory plan, rezoning, you name it. And sometimes there is a disconnect between the direction and purpose of those plans and then the market development realities. And we've seen this. We've seen this multiple times where the city, the quarters is a good example. I think the quarters on paper, in terms of its philosophy, what it wanted to do, makes sense. And I think a lot of people, okay, take this underutilized big neighborhood just east of downtown and turn it into a livable urban neighborhood. And I think fine, that on paper it makes sense. And I think, but where they seem to be really struggling is obviously execution. A plan is only as good as its ability to be built and realized. Other than that, it's just a document that costs millions of dollars to prepare and to go through the formal processes, countless hours of public engagement, you name it. And it's meaningless. And in fact, we've seen plans for that neck of the woods. They've been around for 30 years and evolved and been amended. And so I think one of the differences is municipalities have a certain lens that they view how they want to redevelop certain sites. And it has to be married to the way the private sector can actually develop and redevelop those sites that are marketable. Because at the end of the day, unless the city is being the developer and wants to sort of market it and sell it and be the landowner and landlord, you need they're looking really for the private sector to kind of do this. They're putting a plan together, they're putting in the infrastructure, and then they're hoping that some of the private landowners in there put up their sites for sale,
right.
Or they have some of their own sites. They say, okay, hey, we want you to develop it. And so I think where they need to really they need to try to, I think, marry themselves with saying, hey, private sector, how would you guys look at unlocking the value of this? And establish maybe a framework where they can say, we want whatever is happening here to align with some of our big city building goals.
Sure.
And I think that's the best way to kind of use the resources, the velocity, and the market intelligence that the private sector has to kind of come and bring these plans to reality.
So I was going to say, there's different types of land that you can
Yes.
fall into. There's the quarters, there's Blatchford, and just those two alone have vastly different circumstances tied to them. And so where does tying to a developer, for example, play in versus just try to attain market intelligence first as to what you should go after? So what is the role of industry in that? Where do you start?
Well, I think it really is about, can this plan be built? Can we find somebody to take on the risks to buy the site, develop a specific type of building, and or sell or lease that space? And I think that's the big disconnect. And sometimes a plan is just a plan. If for whatever reason the market isn't ready to buy into that site or want to redevelop that site, you have to really acknowledge that. And I think that's what the quarters have missed. You look at it sort of from a plan view, say, oh, it kind of makes sense. But why hasn't there been any opportunity? And so then, and if it isn't, from a market standpoint, ripe for redevelopment, what are the tools the city needs to employ to sort of encourage that? Is it through the use of incentives? Is it tax breaks? Is it, hey, you know what, we really want to see the quarters redeveloped. We're going to bring on a per unit incentive for developers to come in and give them 10 or 20 grand per unit. Up to, we have a certain budget amount of X. The reality is with quarters, they've spent millions and millions of dollars upgrading the public infrastructure.
Yep.
And it's
beautiful.
beautiful.
It's beautiful. It's just sitting there completely underutilized.
Yeah.
How much of that? How much of that do you think is the fact that the city went in preemptively? They do their plan, they rezone it. They don't control all of it.
That was the first mistake.
Land assembly
Exactly.
was impossible.
Exactly.
basically, yeah.
And so then by rezoning it, you've artificially inflated the value in the minds of these
the perceived
landowners
value.
that
Totally.
perceived. And it's a disconnect from what the market's willing to pay based on the fact that it is the most desirable place. So if a developer is going to risk developing there, they want to get it for a cheaper rate.
Right.
This happened in the city of Fort McMurray. They rezoned their entire downtown for 30-story towers and everything else, and then they said, oh, we need to buy some land to do some of this. and the private developers came
Yeah.
around and they're like, hey, yeah, great.
Sign the check.
Exactly. Now we think the land value's here, and they did. And that's another problem. But there's opportunity. So Calgary's a great example.
Yeah.
Do you think that an arm's length organization, and the City of Edmonton's talked about this,
Yeah.
it's been in front of council a couple times and it gets shot down.
Yeah.
Does that solve any of the issues, or is it one step, I guess, not far enough from involving kind of that private sector and being able to be dynamic?
I think what it does, it establishes, I mean, I've been an advocate and supporter of an arm's length, call it development agency, similar to CMLC in Calgary, or I think Build Toronto, because it requires them to create their own executive management structure.
Right.
They have a financial obligation to provide a return on the monies that are invested through the City of Edmonton, or this municipality, not City of Edmonton. And I think there's something about that. It almost sort of says, wear the private development sector hat to unlock value of these lands, so you can return a dividend to the city, the municipality. No different than EPCOR, right? Where it's an arm's length corporation, allowed to sort of run independently from the city.
Yeah.
And the city gets a benefit in the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars every year.
But the city then, in those cases, still has directive through their city plans, through
That's correct.
whatever else that
Absolutely.
says it has to look like this. You're not.
There's a mandate, right?
Yep.
So there's mandates that they have to sort of abide by, but it just allows them, I think, to have the big thing is the velocity side of things that the private sector is able to do, and also leverage some of the the financial tools that are available to allow them to go in and invest in the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Assemble the lands to control it. I mean, that's the big thing, control land. I mean, with Blatchford, I mean, here it's kind of like what they've done there, right? They control the land, they control the narrative, and now it's just, up to the builders to start building and executing. I think the difference is that you still have, it's a city-run department, and with that, there's just how things are operated in municipal standpoint versus sort of as an arm's length or a private.
Exactly, and they've been able to execute, but you wonder, with the expertise of private developers, or you create a third party, and they brought in Tom and whatnot to do it, and it's great, but could it be done in a more efficient manner? And following the mandate of the city, it has to be built like this to this infrastructure standard. There was always a fear that if the city kind of let go a bit, that it's like you're going to have people coming in and asking for, well, you know what, we don't want to build to this standard. Let's water it down. Do we have to build the right of way to this standard?
Yeah.
Hey, let's put in single family housing.
Or we're going to actually rezone this whole area and redo the plans for it all. And
So you have to be able to find that balance where if you say this is the vision, what can we do, and how can that align, and how can we also be a little bit adaptable?
Right.
If we say the plan is all towns
Yeah.
and towers, and then you say, hey, you haven't had allowance here for this built form, it meets your density targets and everything else, and that's what the market wants. Can that work?
I think they have to be. I mean, you look at it, it's a area of land. It's going to take decades to realize, and through that, there's going to be various market cycles, different demand cycles, and if you can't have a plan that adapts to that, you're going to it's going to run stale, or it's going to kind of take that much longer to develop and build out.
There's a degree of flexibility you need in there.
100%, especially on a site that big. No different than if you build any other new large neighborhood. Like, you would just look at how Canada Lands has evolved their plans over the years with the redevelopment of the old base.
And
U of A, likely the same thing with the land trust and developing some of their future, the 240 or whatever that is, and the Michener Park. I mean, you have to have a model that adapts to new market realities, and to say, well, no, we're going to hold firm. You're going to find yourself, falling short. And so, I mean, another big advantage of the municipalities kind of partnering with the private sector is the sense of urgency. When a developer has either loan facilities or guarantees on the line, and the clock is ticking, it forces you to act. When you don't have that urgency, you can take your time, and then that's why things don't materialize.
Exactly.
Because no one's going to be calling in the loan in 24 months.
Yeah.
right? The loan just kind of keeps going on, and you're like, well,
It's your internally funded loan that
we'll
keeps
just
going,
have to go in front of council
Yeah.
again and tell them why things haven't materialized. You can say COVID, and then looming recession, and a new government, and you name it. I mean, you can kind of keep adding excuse after excuse. The private sector, your role as a developer is to find a way to manage the risks and the headwinds and execute.
At the end of the day, though, too, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It that drive from the private industry perspective, still achieving city goals, the infill goals, meeting the demand in terms of that additional supply in an infill setting. So yeah, I think that's a great motivator. We got another question here that we can hop on this, and then we'll get to our next one. So Bleed Orange and Blue 69.
Assuming no others found.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, cool kids. What do you make of the enterprise land development at the city that owns and plans to develop almost 500 acres of land in suburban areas versus their big city goals and city plan? Well, that's interesting. I mean, I will first say that the city understands that development does happen on the edge of town,
always
suburbs.
Always will.
And, they happen to own land and be part of that development. They control effectively to allow those plans to happen.
Sure.
But they also have targets in terms of infill and everything else. So is it a conflict of interest in terms of their goals? What do you think?
I would say no. I don't think it is. I mean, I've always been a believer that, cities grow up and out unless you have real hard and fast boundaries, whether it's a growth boundary or a geographical constraint, water, mountains, etc. But what I do believe, where the city, I think, could take a leadership role is in maybe showing how actually these new greenfield neighborhoods can be developed, maybe with a little bit more of a different take, maybe something that is kind of can be used as a bit of a, I think, an example for other developers to sort of follow in terms of this is how we want our greenfield neighborhoods to develop out. Yeah. This is how they are designed to be resilient and adaptive over time. And I think they have the ability to do so because, again, they don't have an acquisition facility or a bunch of sort of loan debt that's coming to maturity or could be called on in 24, 36, 48 months. They have that ability to really showcase us, much like Canada Lands has done with all their redevelopments across the country. And they know what they're doing in Griesbach. It's taken a lot longer to build out. But they've held a certain standard, and I think have demonstrated what their mandate was to develop these types of old federally owned sites into great neighborhoods, and I think the city can do that. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's not a this or that. And I don't like when we have this approach to city building. Well, you're either infill or you're suburban. There's no middle ground. I think that's bullshit. I think at the end of the day, we all know cities grow up, they grow out.
And cities need a variety of different opportunities to live, to work. Like not everybody
warehouses,
wants,
and as much as boring and big as warehouses are, they are such an integral part of our overall economy. And even more so now than they ever have been, and they always will. But they're land intensive. That's unless they go vertical, which again changes the dynamics of the pro forma. Because yes, warehouses are built by private sector development companies that want a return. This is why building warehouses in very land-constrained areas like the Lower Mainland are becoming very almost cost-prohibitive because going vertical changes that, and that's to the benefit of Edmonton and Calgary, in my opinion. But that's another topic altogether.
Save that for next week.
That's great. We can. I want to keep going there, but for the sake of time, let's move to our second question because I think this is another interesting one too, and we anticipate more feedback from you guys on this. So, in a kind of early pre-COVID world. And even still today, climate action at a municipal level, where there is moderate or inaction, sometimes at higher levels of government, municipalities started enacting some of their own things. And so in August 2019, City of Edmonton declared a climate emergency. So take that with a grain of salt. If language aside that you use for it, at the end of the day, it's municipal action on climate initiatives. And if you as a municipality, value that in terms of meeting climate goals, reducing greenhouse gases, not just for city-owned facilities, but for what gets constructed within your borders, what are some tools, some carrots, some sticks that can be used? So you had a great idea. Why don't you share it? You talked a little bit about this with us. So what is that?
Well, adaptive reuse. I think that is something, and that is starting to get a lot of attention in the development industry now. And part of that has to do, I think, with reacting to how we're building more climate, resilient cities.
Okay.
And it's one that it's difficult to do. I mean, with our company, we've cut our teeth doing that. It is much more. There's more risk. There's a lot more unknowns, and it takes a certain approach and acknowledgement of that in order to want to do that. Most developers, the easy solution is to tear down and build new. And then you could build brand new, sustainable, LEED, platinum, gold, you name it, net zero. And that's all and well. But I think that we have to acknowledge that, a lot of our urban areas have existing buildings. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of them that have been built over the last 100 years. And a lot of them are just, they're energy hogs. And they produce a lot of GHG emissions. We also know that, city to build new requires a lot of energy. This whole term embodied carbon is becoming a lot more understood and recognized about how do we sort of ensure that we're looking. I mean, the Canadian Investment Bank their mandate is to find a mechanism to invest into properties and or with developers to retrofit buildings. And I mean, they have a recent agreement that they put together with Dream that will do that with a number of their assets across the country. And it really is providing kind of a low interest financing to developers to create more energy efficient buildings. And that's something that municipalities, I think, can take a very, very key role to encourage that, to de-risk that from a development standpoint.
Right.
Because again, looking at it from sort of a business case standpoint, it's tough to likely get your board and your executive committees to kind of agree to it when you say, well, what's the risk? This. What's the reward? Well, the same. Well, I'll tell you what. Why would we take on more risk to get the same reward at the end? Tear it down, build new. We'll build a great building. We'll have a ribbon cutting with the mayor and everyone else telling how green and sustainable it is. Meanwhile, that doesn't necessarily, we've by de facto taken away evaluating the redevelopment or adaptive reuse potential of a building. And and we're starting to see that obviously with the conversion of commercial office buildings in Calgary. And I like how everyone's really talking about that in Calgary. In Edmonton, we did that in the 90s. We kind of been there, done that, Calgary. In the 90s, we had a horrendous vacancy rate, and we had so many inadequate commercial office buildings that we went through that redevelopment progress ourselves, and that was incentivized, right? The City of Edmonton had the $10,000 per unit incentive for developers to take buildings and or build brand new. And or redevelop or convert existing office into residential. But that adaptive reuse is real. It is something that I think needs to be taking a lot more of a closer look at and find a way to sort of, look at, how do we ensure that some of these buildings aren't just quickly torn down, and we're trying to sort of, do what's right in response to this climate emergency, which most major municipalities have declared. I think it's one of the first steps and something that the industry is starting to look at closer, but I think municipalities and any other levels of government really need to take a harder look at it.
Fantastic. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say there's a follow-up question here on that regard, and something I was going to bring up as well is, other than just financing, thinking about low-interest loans and so on, what are the levers that you can use to ensure that people who are thinking about it can now actually execute it and move forward with those types of adaptive reuse projects?
Well, I mean, I think the one question is, what are the major hurdles? And I think is a lot of these buildings were built, during under different building code. And what you're asked to do in order to bring it up to code can be a real challenge. And that's where, again, it goes back to how municipalities can play a role in acknowledging those risks, to saying, hey, this unsprinklered building now, you're changing it from, let's say, a commercial use to a residential. You need to sprinkler this thing. Well, your water main is only so big. Now you got to do all this. Sometimes your exiting requirements, you need to beef up all the fire ratings.
So it's a deeper systematic issue, right? It's not just what the municipality is saying. This is built into national building code.
There's down from levels. there. and that's why I talk about these financial tools that municipalities can offer developers, again, to kind of lower the risk, lower the cost implications that you take on going about these adaptive reuse projects.
So what about a tax abatement strategy, say property tax, and that's something that may be deferred for X number of years, or the lift on that is deferred.
I mean, a good example is the Brownfield grant that the City of Edmonton has had for a number of years. And we've been users of that grant on multiple old gas station sites that we've redeveloped into, sort of more community-oriented type of projects. Or higher, better uses than just simply sitting fallow. And that program has been phenomenal on two fronts. A, in terms of if we're going to have to do a whole bunch of environmental work on a site, prior to even deciding to buy the site, the city covers a big portion of that upfront work cost, right? Up to 80% of your ESA, which can be in the tunes of, $20, $30, $40, $50,000. So to have that is huge. Just for us to go through due diligence and then say, you know what, we have a project here, let's buy it. Now the city then says, okay, there's work that needs to be done to remediate the site. We'll calculate what that cost is to remediate it, and then through the tax lift generated with the new development that's going, help you basically kind of fund really all that upfront cost to remediate the site and to give it a higher, better use. I think it's a phenomenal I think every municipality in this country should have something like this, considering the number of old fallow gas station sites that exist in great locations. And just no one touches because, well, it's a risk, and I mean, with the redevelopment of a lot of these sites, 10 years ago, lenders would just say, no, I don't want to touch it. But with just how we've come a long ways over the years in terms of understanding the environmental contamination risks, how you mitigate this, the technological advances, with chemical injection, other means of being able to remediate a site, has come to a point where the only real underlying risk is and aversion of buying a site is the cost.
It's cost,
And why would I want to buy I have to sink in $700 million to remediate this site, but next door it's clean, and I'm going to buy that, and I'm going to build the same thing I would do there, and so this site can just still sit there. But that tax payment is huge.
I've talked about this a couple times, and one thing that Canada is lacking is a lot of these financial tools that exist to encourage development, and we've talked about local tax incentives, and
tax increment financing.
Exactly, and so one of them is this tax abatement property tax that can be packaged up and sold as a financial instrument to someone else. They can take it, you're developing a site, you get 10 years for whatever reason, 20 years. You can take that now and you can sell it to someone else and you can apply it on their property. You can use that as part of your capital stack and you can lend against it. You can go to, so there's a lot of, especially if you need that up front to make your numbers work, right? And I think part of that is the province giving allowance for some of these things.
There's again, municipality. Dr. Seasons here would know. Having municipalities, they're creatures of the province, but they need through legislation to be given the means in order to do these sorts of creative, call it tax structures or revenue generating structures, beyond what they're allowed under the current act in the respective province. And so giving them that ability to do that, because every municipality has different sets of challenges. I mean, we all know right now in the GTA and the Greater Vancouver area, it's land availability. And there's not a lot of land available for development, yet you have a very, very high growth in number of people coming here each and every year. And with that comes longer entitlement processes. And so, I think that's where provinces have to really start to take a look at saying, well, how do we empower municipalities to do what they need to do in order to generate more revenue or provide the framework to encourage different types of development. I mean, and I think there was a question here that Mark asked about, I guess, affordable housing. And I think, to work with the private sector to have, we talked about redeveloping certain sites so it achieves certain city building goals, whatever that is in terms of the Save a Built form. We want more mixed use or density around our transit stations. I mean, the affordable housing side, particularly in the context of Toronto or Vancouver, is huge. And I think that's where, again, they can, incentivize that, saying, hey, developer, you provide 100 units of this, and we will waive development charges, or there's a tax thing, or whatever it is at the end of the day to allow them to again, from a development standpoint, it's about de-risking and saying, well, if I have to be asked to do this, what benefit do I have from either a development right standpoint or financially in order for me to do this? Or otherwise I'm just going to, I'm not going to weigh the risks and I'm just going to go elsewhere. I mean, capital's fluid. Capital's mobile. Capital can go anywhere, and it's faster today than it was 10 years ago, and I think it's just going to continue to accelerate. So capital will move where they know they can get a reasonable return in a reasonable time period.
You know, and this is one thing I've rallied on a couple times in our segment here and on Ideas podcast. But for me, housing affordability, at the root of it is supply and demand.
Correct.
And so where you have constraints, geographical or from an administrative perspective or whatever else, it tips that balance. The things we can do to encourage more supply, because there is a big imbalance still, and that drives up the price. It drives down the market affordability, and we're not talking about specifically affordable units. We're talking about market rate, and I will rally on this all day long. I think the affordability that exists right now in Edmonton and some of our prairie cities is very important to preserve. And it's an advantage for us. It means that my kids have a better chance of living here, of having home ownership, of everything else, and being part of that Canadian dream, whatever that is. How do you make that easier? How do you make those processes easier? And that's, I think, one of the, as you said, it might be time, it might be deleveraging that risk, it might be whatever else, but allowing that supply to
unleashed.
Exactly, and what the market is demanding.
And, with the full understanding that there's sort of quote unquote market failures embedded into that.
Absolutely.
Like you can capture supply issues and satisfy demand. There's going to be segments that just don't get their needs met through that process.
100%.
And
You're
so
right.
there's that aspect as well.
Yeah,
exactly. They're and that's where the social safety net that is the government does need to step in, because the market alone isn't going to provide that all, and that can be incentivized too. Hey, private industry, we can do this for you, and if you provide this, and we can provide additional cash injections to make this possible, this unit typology, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I think the supply issue is multifaceted, and there's different interests I think that come in play, especially in some of our larger municipalities. I mean, where you have obviously how much should we allow cities to grow, particularly in the face of climate change, and that, because that is also, again, urban areas contribute a massive amount to GHG emissions. How do we ensure that cities are growing the way they should be in order to either respond to that in a positive manner? There are land use policies around the preservation of not just environmentally sensitive areas, like in Ontario, or obviously escarpments but quality agricultural lands. And it's funny in the Alberta context too, especially Edmonton and Calgary. We kind of say, well, we have land as far as I can see, right? We're not agricultural land. The thing is, Edmonton, Calgary are the two biggest municipalities and the fastest growing municipalities. Are surrounded by some of our most prime agricultural land. And we've seen this, not just from an urban municipality saying, we need to be a bit more sensitive on how much agricultural land we displace for urban growth, but we're also seeing smaller municipalities really take a hard look at that. Leduc County to the south, Strathcona County to the east. It is becoming something that's becoming, and I think of, right now, to build supply in Edmonton, Calgary is relatively easy. Land is there, and you can just kind of keep growing to accommodate that spot, and it's low. It's relatively easy to go vertical on that type of land development, right? To get the plans approved, zone it, subdivide, build your homes, and accommodate this. It's easy, and I say that it's not easy, but there's a process. But versus places like Toronto, Vancouver, which are land constrained, and you have a longer entitlement process. It's longer to bring product onto the market. A high rise, it doesn't matter if you're 15 stories or 50, from the day you acquire a site to the day you go through, entitlements, all your permits, go vertical, here's the keys to your unit. I mean, it's a 5-year period easily. And that's just for a 200, 250 unit, 500 unit building. That in itself, you look at it versus if you could bring on 1,500 homes or low-rise development in the form of townhomes, duplex, singles, that's way quicker to bring on 1,500 units than it ever would to bring on 500. And so in those markets, I don't know what the answer is, because it is important to, I think, acknowledge how we preserve a lot of our prime agricultural lands. Yes, in big old open sky Alberta, it's important, and we can't just say, well, we got a lot, right? Got thousands, millions of acres, and I think you're going to start to see that really shape how our cities grow, and talk about the easy. I mean, you're seeing that even shift right now in the Edmonton in the Calgary context, where a lot of our greenfield developers are knowing that it's not as easy to build suburban communities anymore. There are more costs being pushed down. There are more, land use policies that are kind of restricting how much you're allowed to grow out. It's longer to bring those lands onto development. There's a lot more coordination from an infrastructure.
I was going to say
all of that.
Stronger levying.
At one time, it was sort of just it'll pay for itself. I mean, we know the model. Well, there's a lot more coordination saying, well, wait a minute, all the other stuff that goes along with it, fire, bus stops, transit terminals, police stations, you name it. And so with all that, it's over years, it's a compounding thing. And and I think we've seen that in the Toronto markets and even Ottawa and the Lower Mainland. These types of things have been in play for a long time, and we're starting to see that Edmonton, Calgary, and to your point about preserving this affordability of housing, or accessibility to housing, really, is something I think it is over time is going to be a challenge in these municipalities. It won't be for a number of years, but I just see the policy framework of where things are going, that it's heading in that direction. And and so it's I don't know what the supply and opening up the spigots isn't good either. I mean, because at the end of the day, I think there has to be some element of a control, because the municipalities have a responsibility on behalf of citizens to ensure that how they grow is still ensuring that they're creating I think an enjoyable city, and there's their own financial obligations they have in terms of providing services. So it's there's a lot of push pull, and I am happy to be working in the City of Edmonton, because I find that this there isn't this us versus them mentality, and I do believe that you have that case more so in Toronto and Vancouver versus developers versus administrators, and I think that's a very, very bad situation to be in, because if you're not around at least at the same sitting at the same table, wanting the same things, and having a good dialogue versus saying, I'm going to pin you with this. It's like, well, then guess what? The buyer gets pinned with it.
Exactly.
And then it's a fight. And I think, the City of Edmonton, and hats off to Kim Petrin and a lot of people in her team, it's a very, okay, how do we get this done? That doesn't come without its hurdles and disagreements. That's development. It will happen. But they have a very much an open say, okay, we've set out these goals to build a better city. How can we work with the industry to achieve these goals? Work with us, and hopefully we get it done. And you see that in terms of just the timelines it takes to get a project, whether they're small or large, approved. And that both is in Edmonton and Calgary context. And I think as long as we have that and that mentality, I think we'll continue to be able to address the supply side things at a very reasonable time.
And a topic for a future show, and maybe we should have Dr. Summers on this. He was a guest on that podcast with CBC, talking about some of the slow incremental changes to the zoning bylaw, and specifically yellow belt, so that in municipalities where you have exclusive single-family zoning, and how we've effectively done away with that, and how that allows for additional types of infill, and what that means in Edmonton for infill growth. We have gone a long way away from the original topic here, talking about adaptive reuse as a tool for it.
We've kind of gotten into the crux of what planning is, actually, which is great.
This is fun.
But I mean, with Chris, we can talk all day long. Dr. Seasons, we appreciate you continuing to add your comments here. Maybe you need to be a guest on one of our shows. You can join virtually. If we can figure out how to do that, that would be a lot of fun.
Can I comment on? I know you, Mark. You made one major trend underway: social impact investing, ESG is concerned. I actually think on the topic of adaptive reuse, and I think this is exactly why we've seen the CIB Bank and Dream come together on retrofitting a lot of their existing buildings, because Dream is a big organization, and they have a lot of these ESG mandates as a large corporation on behalf of either public or private pension funds to address that very issue of ESG, whether it's through creating more environmentally resilient buildings, affordable housing, etc. And I think that, the adaptive reuse is going to you're going to find a lot more of these larger sophisticated groups, I think, take on these types of projects and look at ways of doing that by virtue of responding to either their main shareholders, may it be, provinces or governments or, private sector, ensuring that they're delivering on these ESG goals that they've set out for themselves. And again, the adaptive reuse of buildings, it falls right in line with that. I mean, you kill a lot of birds with one stone, following that and redeveloping a lot of these properties to give them a new use and again, another 100+ years of life.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
So, I mean, we'll let's run through them quick. We had some images here, but talking about adaptive reuse of some of the buildings that you guys have done at Beljan. Shirley, why don't you throw some of those up, because I'd love to show them to some of the viewers here. This is the Strathcona on White Ave, the old Strat Hotel.
Yeah.
And you guys have done a phenomenal job on that. You talked about in your podcast with Idea, this next one here that I want to show, the Oliver Exchange that got you guys a lot of notoriety outside the industry. And that's created this great little commercial hub there. But that was an old a switching station?
Yeah, it was a telephone exchange building built in the early 1900s. It was built by a private investor who was developing a private telephone network in the city of Edmonton, and eventually it was absorbed through Edmonton Telephones, and then from there TELUS, and then when TELUS was decommissioning this, and there was additions over the years. I mean, it was originally built, I think, in 1912, and then they added it on a part in 1939, 1940, and then in the 1960s. And here we took this building, again, built very well, maintained very well. The nice thing about buying usually buildings off of a utility company or a telephone company is that they're maintained, they're spectacular, versus the previous one, the Strathcona Hotel. I mean, that thing was a beast. I mean, but one of the oldest buildings in the city of Edmonton, or in the province for that matter. And to be repositioned into a mix of commercial and retail uses. Again, Oliver Exchange, same thing, converted this into a community-oriented retail hub, and connecting people through commerce versus through telephones. Sure.
So Bleed Orange and Blue 69 here said the Idea Info Symposium there is next Wednesday, and we'll give a little plug for that because Raina and I are both moderators for different panels for that. Let's go to the last one here. So this is another one nearby, old infrastructure substation building on 124th, right by my place, that you guys have just done. And again, reactivating this old space, historical space. You told me a bit about what you guys had to do for the windows and the handcrafted wood and all that stuff.
I mean, the adaptive reuse of a lot of these heritage buildings are great, and where we really benefit from them is the fact that in exchange for designated municipal historic resource, we get a certain amount of funds. We're eligible for a amount of grants. And so through the City of Edmonton, and it's a very seamless process, it's fantastic. Having access, again, to that type of incentive allows us to do what we can do with these buildings. Without that, it's that much more of a financial encumbrance and risk that we would have to really pay. Do most tenants feel that I can pay $10 more a foot because you designated this building? Probably not, no. Can you get a little bit of a squeeze out of it? For sure you can. And a lot of people, because it's character space, there's value that they have, they'll pay more. But usually the delta is not, it doesn't cover the true cost of that versus building brand new and where a tenant's threshold is in terms of rates. So having that, the access to that grant is massive. And especially, if you want to see the adaptive reuse of heritage assets, the adaptive reuse, I think even existing buildings, going back to having the ability to have access to some sort of financial tools and incentives to look at this as an option and incentivize the industry. Because right now, adaptive reuse is it's a bit of a niche thing. So with niche comes a price tag. It's higher to build. It's higher typically from a design standpoint for designers to get in there. You have existing conditions. So but yet as an outcome, you don't necessarily see the financial back-end reward in order to doing it. So you're kind of competing with all these new guys building brand new buildings. You're going to get the same per square foot, but I'm taking on more risk. So there's got to be a way to kind of at least help. Once it becomes a bit more mainstream, the hope is that you see price compression, Designers start to feel more comfortable working within the context.
Sure.
It just, but that takes time, and we're talking.
But you're also always dealing with unknowns when you start opening up walls, right?
And every time's different, I think.
I'm saying this as someone who's renovating
Yeah.
a whole home right
Yeah,
now,
yeah.
right? Open it up and what have we found? Yeah, surprise! And then the contractor's like,
and that's how it is. I mean, and we go in that, with a bigger budget, a bigger contingency, knowing you're going to burn through it. You're going to find stuff. You always will. But your approaches to it also, you learn from each one. What to do, what not to do. How far do we go? How far do we not go? And then that's also sort of finessing it so it ultimately becomes a profitable endeavor and an investment.
100%. Well, lots of great comments. Thank you, Dr. Seasons. Thank you, Bleed Orange and Blue 69 for your involvement. This has been great. And we won't reveal Bleed Orange and Blue's their persona yet, but they're going to be a guest here in the future.
Awesome. Let's go
And
on.
yeah, Dr. Seasons, let's get you on here as well. This was fun, Chris.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing it.
Thanks
Appreciate it. And again, till next time, if you guys have interest, put comments in the thread. We'll always follow up on that. And finally, if you want to be a sponsor of the show, if you want, we're happy to sponsor and represent some of the local, coffee shops, breweries, whatever else. We don't even need much product, but we'd love to represent you here. Thanks again. Until next time, it's been a lot of fun. We'll see you guys later.
Thanks.